Should the British government and royal family offer a formal apology to the descendants of slaves? It's time for our head-to-head. So, a new poll has found that apparently 60% of Brits believe that we should apologise to Caribbean nations and the descendants of enslaved people. King Charles himself came out last year to support research into the monarchy's historic links to the slave trade. He also expressed his personal sorrow at the suffering caused and refused to rule out paying future reparations. So, should the King and the Prime Minister go one step further and make a formal apology? Let us know your thoughts. Email me, gbviews@gbnews.com. Tweet me at gbnews. While you're there, go and vote in our poll. I imagine there might be a slightly different result to the one that was done in this report. But I will bring you those results shortly. Now, going head-to-head on this, our CEO of anti-monarchy group Republic, Graham Smith, and political commentator Suzanne Evans. Thank you very, very much. Suzanne, should we get on bended knee and apologise for historic links to slavery?
You know, Patrick, on the one hand, I think this poll is good because it shows that obviously the slave trade is something that we all think is utterly abhorrent and certainly deserves apologising for. The problem I have with this is that no apology is ever going to be enough. And I also think it's somewhat absurd that in this day and age, we're talking about asking people who weren't involved in slavery to apologise for people who weren't involved in slavery. I mean, the whole thing's really quite absurd, really. And as I said, no apologies ever going to be enough. The King, as you say, has apologised. The Prince of Wales has apologised. I remember the family of Gladstone, the former Prime Minister, whose father was a slave trader, has apologised. And in all three cases, we've been told, well, that's not good enough. I'm sorry. No, just not good enough. And then, of course, these calls for apologies are always followed by calls for reparations as well. Money to be paid. And again, I think no amount of money is ever going to be enough to satisfy these campaigns. So recently, for example, we've had the Church of England saying it's going to set aside £1 billion to make reparations for slavery. They originally said they were going to put aside £100 million, which seems like a huge figure in itself, but no, that wasn't enough. So it's been up to £1 billion. Right. So where do we stop here? That's my question.
OK, I'm going to go now to the CEO of anti-monarchy group Republic, Graham Smith. I mean, look, surely you would be, the clue's in the name, Graham, isn't it? You want them to apologise, you want them to abolish themselves, you want them to bankrupt themselves. I mean, come on, this is why you're in favour of it, isn't it? You don't feel the need to actually apologise, surely?
Well, yes, I do. I think Britain should, and I think certainly the monarchy should. I mean, Charles hasn't apologised. I don't know what that was referring to. He has not apologised. And the thing is, the monarchy itself, particularly the monarchy, this is a hereditary institution that tells us, look at our glorious past of 1,000 years. That's why I should continue. That's why I should be head of state, says Charles. Look at the history. You can't do that and then say, oh, but ignore the other bit of the history. Now, the royals instigated, promoted, sponsored and invested in slavery all the way through to its abolition from, Elizabeth and James I and all the rest of it.
Did any of your ancestors, Graham, just out of interest, did any of your ancestors?
I don't know, but the point is I don't sit on a fortune. Now, Charles inherited an estimated £600 million when his mother died, didn't pay inheritance tax, and a significant amount of that has been inherited down the line from one monarch to the next since the King Georges of the 18th century, who were investing in slavery. And, of course, the monarchy celebrated and revelled in the whole notion of empire, which promoted slavery and then continued it in a different way after slavery was abolished through indentured labour and all the rest of it. So they've got quite a bit to apologise for. And I think reparations, I mean, in terms of how much, well, someone put it very neatly, the clue's in the name. When these societies are repaired from the damage that we have caused by
Suzanne, is that not incredible?
Killing them and enslaving them.
Is that not just an incredibly difficult thing to quantify? I mean, so let's just take some of the Caribbean islands, for example, like Jamaica. I mean, what do we repair it back to? I mean, what was it before the slave trade, etc.? What was it really? I'm going to go to Suzanne and then I'll go to you.
It's about recognising the fact that the chronic...
Graham, sorry, Graham, just to say, Graham, I'll go back to you, Graham, but I was going to bring Suzanne in on that point, yeah.
Like I said, it's never going to be enough, and that's the problem. The other question here is, this argument is very binary. It's always portrayed as though it's Europe against the African nations in particular. And of course, it wasn't like that. We know that there were African nations that were complicit in the slave trade, and it couldn't have functioned as it did without that complicity. And yet there are never calls, are there, for African nations to apologise for their part in it, to make reparations. You know, if you look at its most basic level, every single person on this planet today has in some form been a victim of slavery or has been involved in slavery. That's a fact of life. So where does this end? You know, we can't go around each asking each other for an apologies, making reparations. You know, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. There comes a point where we have to draw a line under this historically and focus, I think, on modern slavery. According to Anti-Slavery International, there are like 50 million.
Graham, what would you say if what would you say if I asked you if you were just suffering from white guilt?
Well, no, I mean, with the greatest respect, that this nonsense about, you know, where do we draw the line? It's a little bit of truth. I mean, we negotiate with people and say, well, what do we agree a point where we stop and we say, well, this is what the settlement's going to be, and that's the deal. And of course, those African countries that in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries were involved in slavery, we then and other European countries conquered. We had a nice little cozy meeting in Berlin and said we'll conquer the entire continent and enslave the rest of them, not quite as slaves in the traditional sense, but in indentured labour, taking away their rights, destroying their artefacts, stealing them, sending them off to London and so on. So, you know, we destroyed that continent many times over, and it's a bit rich to then say that they should then start to make reparations. It's, you know, there is systemic chronic poverty and inequality right across these societies because of what European nations did, and it's not unreasonable to make some effort.
I mean, is that actually true, though?
Damage.
I mean, that's the issue with all of this. I mean, is that actually true? Because, you know, we've got things like the Barbary slave trade, for example. As Suzanne, you know, as you were saying, these slave trades would not be able to function if it had not been for actual African people themselves entrapping their own individuals and then sending them to us. I'll have a look now at where slavery is still prominent, for example. Eritrea is a country where it's still prominent. I mean, there's quite a lot of these. Afghanistan, Turkey, it says here, Tajikistan, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. I mean, North Korea, obviously, we all know that, don't we?
And here.
But, I mean, there's a load of places where slavery is still prominent. We had an issue with it, you know, back in the day. We then stopped it. I mean, seriously, what are we really apologising for, Suzanne? I'm paying for.
Well, like I say, I don't think we should really. We should be focused on the very real problem of modern day slavery. There's nothing we can do about the historic slave trade, really and truthfully. It's appalling. It's awful. We're all agreed on that. But there is something that we can and should do about modern slavery. You know, 50 million people worldwide, victims of modern slavery in this day and age is utterly appalling. A quarter of those are children. For goodness sake, let's focus on what we can do something about in the here and now. Let's change lives in the here and now.
That is a separate issue because the issue of reparations is...
Final point, Graham. Sorry, just final point on this. Can I just ask, look, you know, I'm just reading here, the Greek Republic, obviously, you know, perfectly entitled to do what you're doing. You do it very effectively to an extent, although the royal family does still exist, so I don't know how effective, to be fair. But, you know, set up years ago, you know, would you be willing to commit to an investigation into the people who founded Republic and all of your members and look at whether or not there's any historic links to the slave trade for any of you? And if there is, you apologise and you pay reparations. Would you be up for that?
If Republic institutionally, as an organisation, had that kind of links, then of course. But I mean, you know, we were founded in the 1980s, so no, it's unlikely. But I mean, this is the point. The point is that it's not about trying to resurrect the dead slaves from 200 years ago and apologise to them. It's their ancestors are still struggling with the inequalities and lack of wealth as a result of that slavery, in the same way that we, as their descendants, we as descendants of the people that enslaved
more so, Graham, than, you know, like my relatives who were like Irish peasant farmers. Just out of interest, you think that people are struggling more than that?
Slavery and that empire, in the same way that they're still suffering the consequences of what we did to them, and that is why we should do something. And it's not an open-ended, blank check. It's a process where we try to rectify that damage that we did to them.
OK, look, both of you, thank you very much. Really good stuff, that. And I no doubt we'll chat to you both again very, very soon. That is the CEO of the anti-monarchy group Republic, Graham Smith, and political commentator Suzanne Evans. Look, who do you agree with?